how do we think about young people? How does that thinking about young people shape our actions, or our interaction and our engagement with them? And what does that mean for the outcomes of youth and the programs that we run? So what I want to do right now is just to do a little activity. You all, by now, should have gotten to know the people at your table. So what I want you to do is just jot down what comes to mind when you hear the word youth or adolescent. Okay. And also, what do you think comes to mind of sort of the general public, people who may not be involved in youth programs? What do you think comes to their mind when they hear the word youth or adolescent? So if you could take a few minutes just to jot down what you think, and then I'm going to have you all share with each other at the table. So I'm interested in hearing what your discussions were about. Okay. So when you think about youth, when you hear the word youth or adolescent, what comes to mind? What do you think comes to mind for the general public, maybe people who don't work with youth? What are the labels? What are the signifiers? What are the descriptors that come to mind? Does anybody feel like sharing? Yes.
We came up with rebellious.
Rebellious. Sorry?
Rebellious, immature, hormonal, volatile, pull up your pants. Hotheads, disrespectful, naive, unaware, moody. We go on.
That was that was a good list. So there was hormonal, pull up your pants, immature. What else was there? There was a number of things. Disrespectful.
Naive.
Okay.
Unaware.
All right, let's save some for another for another group. Thank you. Anyone else? Anyone else? Any other? Yes. Fun. I like that
That's
one.
what I was going to say. Fun, but I also thought about, I think honesty, and they would say disrespectful.
Okay, so honesty. So maybe they tell the truth probably a little bit more than some of us, right? Okay. Yes? Is anybody else? Was there a woman over here? Oh, okay. Oh, yes.
I didn't actually write this down, but I have noticed, I think they're more tolerant.
More tolerant?
Yeah.
In what way?
Like, just accepting of different people.
Okay. So that they tend to be more accepting of different people. Okay. All right. Anything else? Our future. Yes. 1, 2.
Entitled and pressured.
Entitled and pressured. Okay. Oh, sorry. Yes.
Technologically savvy.
Technologically savvy. Yes. Yes.
Refreshing.
Refreshing. Last one over in the back. Yes. Bold and creative. Okay. So there are lots of labels. There's lots of descriptors. I'm sure each of us in our work with youth have probably heard descriptors that other people would apply to the young people that we serve, and we might cringe a little bit, right? Does anybody have that experience? Right, I do. Right, I cringe a lot when I hear many of the labels ascribed to young people. In the work that I do at UW, so I'm an assistant professor of educational policy studies, and part of my role is to provide courses for our education and education services minor. So for students who want to go into education, who but don't want to be a classroom teacher, but they want to do youth work, they want to be adult allies, they want to work in community-based programs and other kinds of programs working with youth. When they come into my classroom, when they say they want to work with youth, I hear this long list of words that kind of look like this, right? So at risk, broken, in need of saving, troublemakers, right? And I ask them, especially for the students who say, I just want to work with at-risk youth. And so I'm like, well, what do you mean by that? And they start to stutter, right? They get a little uncomfortable. And I'm like, do you mean black youth? Brown? Latino, right? Poor? Rural poor? Like, what are you talking about? Right? So what happens in our culture, in our society, is that these kinds of labels becomes proxies. They become proxies for things that we don't want to say, right? So urban, inner city, broken, at risk, need to be saved, need to be fixed. Those kinds of terminology is really rooted in these sort of racial undertones that we don't necessarily deal with on the surface. When I was growing up in Los Angeles, I participated in a youth-led program. It was a statewide organization. Can you all still hear me if I step away from this mic? Okay. So it was a statewide youth-led initiative, and I was inspired by the organization. Young people in middle school and high school were leading conferences, speaking to the school board, traveling up and down the state, just doing amazing things that I didn't feel that many adults could do or many of my teachers could do. And it was really amazing. And I joined the organization when I was about maybe 13 or so. And as I went through the program, I became the president of this organization and, had all these different kinds of roles. And I felt like the adults who were sort of supporting us through these efforts really believed in me and saw potential in me that I didn't always see in myself. But there were moments when I was slightly uncomfortable with the language they used to describe and define me. Right. So I grew up in LA. I grew up in South Los Angeles. When I was growing up, it was South Central Los Angeles, and now the media has said South Los Angeles. So anyway, so the connotation that comes with growing up in South Central Los Angeles, people always made these comments about how rough my life might have been, right? Or they made these assumptions about who my parents were, who they were not, based on where I was from. And I remember the director of this organization, I read something that she wrote about me, and I knew that she loved me, I knew that she saw potential in me, but the tone of the letter where she was describing me was very much like I had no parents, that I wasn't smart on my own, but that it was only because of this organization that I was who I was. And I had a real problem with that. And as a young person, I didn't really have the language, right, to express my feelings, but I knew that it made me uncomfortable. So as a researcher now, I look back on that experience and recognize that, those are racial microaggressions, right? There were subtle racial slights. And I also realized that while this person did believe in me, right? This person did see my potential, but at the very same time, she was sort of making it seem as though the organization saved me, right? It took on this very paternalistic language, right? This very pejorative language that really viewed me as something, as an empty person, right? As someone who was lacking everything. And it wasn't until I came into this organization that I received all the greatness, and now that I am great, right? And so as I look back on my experience and as I research other programs and sort of solicit the experiences of young people in programs and also the experiences of adult allies, it's imperative for me to talk about the social context, to talk about race, gender, class, how all these things shape our work and our understanding of youth, right? So I talk so much to my students about how we think, right? The language we use, how we think about young people will always shape how we interact and engage with them. And sometimes we don't really recognize that it's happening. We don't recognize that we might be excluding someone's cultural background or that we might be offending someone. And part of that is because of our own discomfort with using race language or exploring our own identities. So a lot of my talk will be about exploring how framing is connected to social identity and how that's connected to the experiences of the young people we work with. So the language of at-risk and broken youth, when I think about those kinds of words, it's a very deficit frame, right? Deficit meaning that the language, it describes that there's something missing, that there's something lacking. And all of you in the room, right, work with young people where you know that they're powerful and that they have a sense of agency. But I would say that most of the world don't always think about young people in those ways. They usually think about them in deficit terms. That deficit thinking, right, no doubt shows up in not only how we interact with young people, but also the curriculum that we develop in our programs, right? How we present information, how we ask questions, right? Those things sort of seep in. Okay. The deficit frames sort of seep into our work, and sometimes it's very unconscious. When I think about framing, I get really emotional, particularly in my work with youth of color, and particularly Black youth. Right, the how we think, how we frame, right, the language that we use. That is deficit in nature is also very much connected to racial stereotypes. And if we look around about what's happening in our country, what's happened in Ferguson, what's happened in New York, what happened here in Ohio and Cleveland, right? That young Black men, Black youth in general, are being killed, right, based on these frames, based on these deficit thinking, right, this fear, right? You are this way, therefore you must be, you must be criminal, right? That there are certain frames about young people in general as being hormonal and, out of control. But then there's another script, right, that's applied to youth of color, poor youth, urban youth, rural youth, right? There are other labels that are attached to specific kinds of youth, and that's something that we all need to be patient and be mindful of, right? Just to sort of explain how my work sort of fits into some of the work that you all are doing. I've mentioned a lot around the race and social class and gender dynamics, and how the framing and the deficit terminology that kind of can seep into our programs. They're also very much connected to funding streams, right? And so I've worked with a lot of organizations where the adult allies, while they may not view youth in that way, they may have a very asset-rich understanding of the young people they work with and the communities that they work with, right? They believe that young people come into their programs with gifts and talents and with skills that just need to be nurtured, that just need to be enhanced. And they don't view them in a deficit way. But the funding streams, when they're applying for grants, right, they have to use this language of at risk and broken, even if it makes them feel uncomfortable. How many of you all have had that sort of experience where the donors, they expect that, right? They're surprised when they walk into your program and they see people speaking, right? They're surprised when programs run smoothly, right? And you're like, well, why exactly are you surprised, right? So sometimes there's this mismatch, right, between how we might perceive our programs, how we perceive the young people we work with, and how the outside world, who we depend on for support of our programs. And so I recognize that that's a very tense and sometimes complicated relationship between leaders of youth-led initiatives. Okay. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is the philosophy and pedagogy. So philosophy sort of being the understanding and the philosophy or the ways of your program, right? Every philosophy is different. Programs are different. I think sometimes when we are in an organization, we tend to think that other organizations are just as good, and that's not the truth, right? There are many wonderful programs, and there's some programs that are challenged and might need some work. It's part of the beauty of this kind of work, but it's also a reality that every program is different. And the philosophy of the program and the pedagogical practices, right, the curriculum that's developed, the ideas behind teaching and educating and working with youth, it all varies. And guess what it's connected to? It's connected to our framing. It's connected to how we think about youth, right? The strategies we use to teach, right? The way in which we build relationships with young people is all based on how we think about them, right? And also how we think about ourselves. So I wanted to just briefly review some of the research projects that I've done with adult allies, and a new project that I'm about to conduct in Wisconsin. So my first project really talked about or worked with adult allies on the East Coast. And I wanted to understand how they made sense of social, political, educational problems, how they understood race and gender, sexuality, social class, and how that informed their understanding of the youth they worked with. It was a predominantly Black and Latino organization, and how that informed their pedagogical practices and the implementation of their curriculum. And I'm actually going to share a few quotes from that project that really highlights the lived realities that young people have. The newer project that I'm working on in Wisconsin, I don't know if anybody is into Wisconsin news lately, but Wisconsin is the worst place to raise a Black child. 74% of Black youth in Madison live in poverty. And it's also the worst state for Black women. Processing that is always difficult for me. In some of the organizations that I've worked with outside of Wisconsin and California and New York, there was a sort of a sense of urgency around discussing issues of race and power and privilege and social class with young people and having young people engage in those kinds of conversations. And in Wisconsin, over the past year and a half, almost 2 years, we've been engaged in this dialogue around racial and economic disparities in Madison. And everyone's trying to come up with solutions. A lot of them tend to be very interpersonal and not so much on sort of systemic issues, which is an issue I have. But also, no one really engages youth. Right? There's not a whole lot of effort to engage young people around these conversations of racial disparities. And so the next project that I'm exploring will go into community-based programs and youth programs, youth-led initiatives to understand how young people are having these conversations about race, how adult allies sort of assist young people in helping them understand their social identities and what it means to be in a context where racial disparities and economic disparities are so very prevalent, especially when there's a discourse or there's an understanding around Madison in particular being this very liberal, open place. And it's actually on like the top 10 list of best cities to raise a family. And everyone's like, yeah, it's the best place to raise a family if you're rich and if you're white, right? And so how are young people feeling about these kinds of conversations that are happening around them, right, but not happening with them? So from my work with youth workers and both my research and my work with youth, it's important to know that when I do my research, I was also a youth worker at the same time. And so all of you know, working in communities is very important. You care about the young people you work with. And sometimes there's this tension between universities that are near community programs who want to come in often and do some research, and then you see them for several months, maybe a year, and then they bounce, right? And that's a real struggle, and I understand communities who are skeptical. There's a whole history of university research that's not so ethical, right, on communities, particularly marginalized communities, so I get it. And so for me, going into communities, it was very important that I'm also a part of the community, right? And so I worked with young people, worked alongside the adult allies in this space, and so that was really important to me as a researcher and practitioner. So I've already mentioned that youth spaces are philosophically and pedagogically diverse, and one thing that I want to point out is that the current educational climate and policies targeting youth also shapes youth-led initiatives. And so in my work, I found that some of the pressures that schools get around sort of teaching to the test and everything sort of being focused on academics, I found that many programs, youth-led initiatives, community-based programs, are trying to sort of frame their findings and the results of their programs in this very academic way that talks about what students are learning and how it reflects to like core academic subjects, right? So what I mean by that is that all of the social, cultural, emotional, sort of political work that's been done within community programs, within youth-led initiatives, sometimes that falls to the wayside because funders want to know, well, right, how are they doing academically? And so in my work, I found that adult allies who understand that working with youth is a comprehensive effort, right? You cannot engage a person academically without understanding who they are socially, right? Their cultural attitudes, how are they understanding, the world around them. All that is very much important to their development. And so I've found that many programs struggle. They struggle between highlighting sort of the academic outcomes versus the sort of the soft skill stuff, right? The stuff that we find really important, right? The stuff that really makes young people really amazing to work with, right? Is that they're not just learning things in school, right? But there's all this other kinds of development that's equally important, if not more. And so just to highlight some of the perspectives of the adult allies that I've worked with, in thinking about the framing, right, and how that framing, how we think those terms and labels that define youth, they show up in our programs in very interesting ways. So this comes from Leah Daniels, is a pseudonym. who was an executive director for 10 years at an organization on the East Coast, and she talked about when she first came into the organization, deficit language was everywhere, and she had a real problem with it. And she talks about receiving a brochure. And she says, one of the first pieces of printed material I got from EE, the program, was a picture of a Latino kid, and the caption said, "If it wasn't for this program, I'd be in jail or in a coffin," right? And so what happens is, this kind of narrative, it not only gets told about young people, but then students tend to internalize that and then repeat it themselves. So when I was growing up in Los Angeles, I remember I started sort of repeating this script that people had given me. I'm Bianca Baldridge, I'm from South Central Los Angeles, and people go, "Oh, right." And they start coming up with all these assumptions about who I am based on where I'm from. And then it becomes, "Oh, that's so great that you made it out," right? And that's uncomfortable. That doesn't feel good. And from the same organization, Solomon was an adult ally who worked specifically with boys. And here he's talking about some of the tension he had with other adult allies who didn't always truly understand the lived realities or what kinds of circumstances young people were dealing with. And so they were surprised when young people might have, gotten suspended from school for marijuana use or might have had a fight at school, right? So some of the things that, happens to teenagers, right? They were always sort of shocked. And so there was this conversation around expectations, right? And expectations being really high, but then to the point where we don't really allow for young people to, one, be okay with making mistakes, and then sometimes penalizing them for that. And so I just want to point out the first part of the quote, right? So he's referring to other adult allies, people who work with him. We are always shocked when something comes up that hints that our students may be like other students, the other young people that are out there, right? So even though this organization is, is asset-based and doing such wonderful things with young people, from adult allies, there's this judgment sometimes when students make a mistake. Right? And there was always this kind of I used to laugh a lot about it because, you got suspended from school, you got into a fight, you're doing drugs, and it's like, well, didn't you do those things when you were this person's age, right? There's always this amnesia, we were never teenagers. And so that's something I just wanted to point out, right? Do we really understand the lived realities of our young people, right? Do we really understand what they're going through? And how do we respond when something happens, right? Do we pass judgment? Those are things to keep in mind. And so now I want to share just a few, some strategies, some tips, some tools that I picked up along the way. Some of this is informed by my own work with young people, and then some of this is informed by my research. The first thing I do with a lot of my students, especially the ones who come in saying they want to save people, they want to save the broken, at-risk kids, the first thing I ask them to do is really surrender your capes, right? The idea that people need to be saved, right, is a very paternalistic kind of viewpoint, right? And in doing that, you are dismissing the agency, not only that young person has, but also the community from which they come from, right? Thinking that they lack so much means that you're dismissing all of the people who've, helped them get to where they are, right? So to be able to reimagine youth and community, right? While many of us have positive labels and understandings of youth and communities, is to really reflect and to really think, is this a deficit term, right? How am I really understanding the young people that I work with? How am I really understanding the communities that they come from? Okay? And so I'll talk more specifically about community memory and asset mapping, but just to reiterate the importance of social context, right? That there's a lot that we go through, right? And so there's also a lot that young people go through. And they're constantly shaped and reshaped by the things that are happening in their communities, things that are happening in terms of broader policy, that the youth policy and educational policy that shapes them and who they are. And then also recognize that there's a difference between guidance and mentorship and support versus saving, right? When we look at a young person who needs to be sort of saved, right, that sort of puts us in this superior position, right? It's that paternalism is rooted in a very unequal power relationship, right? Where it's this all-knowing adult, and part of that sort of all-knowing adult can also be meshed in with sort of understandings of race and class and gender as well. Can also be a part of it. So to highlight one of the examples is historical community memory. And so from this point on, some of the strategies that I'm going to be speaking about can be activities that you do for yourselves individually, that you can do with other adult allies, and that you can also do with the students you work with. So the first is historical community memory. I love this. So my grandmother always used to say that there's nothing new under the sun, right? So all of the programs and the efforts and the kinds of work that we do with young people, it's happened before, right? I mean, these kinds of efforts and belief and sort of working with and understanding young people as a whole being, right? Those kinds of things aren't new, right? The concepts and maybe some of the terms might be more sophisticated, or the terms itself might be new, but the ideas are still the same. I teach a class on community-based learning for graduate students, and I always sort of start this class with the idea of community-based programs, and I'm like, does anybody know where this picture is from? And pretty much everyone says no. Does anybody know where this picture is from? Okay. Huh? Anybody? Okay. Yes. Yes, exactly, right? So this is from the free breakfast program for Black Panthers in Oakland, California. Exactly, thank you, right? So the idea that, again, recognizing that young people are whole beings, they need to be nurtured, right? And sort of tapping into their social, cultural, emotional needs as well as their academic needs is important, right? The desire for learning and growth, all those things are not unique, right? And that they've been a part of communities for such a long time. And so the question that I always ask my students and that I ask of you all is, what are we missing? What are we missing, or what are we leaving out of our programs and the construction of our programs and of these spaces and youth-led spaces when we dismiss what's happened before, when we miss the history that happened before, right? What exactly, maybe we can gain something from acknowledging that there's something existed before we arrived. The other thing that I like to do is sort of community asset mapping, right? And pointing out what spaces of support, where resources lie in the communities that young people live within. What are they gaining from their communities? Again, when we put these labels, these deficit labels on young people, we're also putting these deficit labels on the communities they come from. And recognizing that assets and resources might look different to us because of our own social realities, because of our various identities and perhaps what we grew up with. So one of the examples I use a lot in thinking about education and family participation or parent participation in schools, a lot of teachers get frustrated with, there's no parents. Parents don't come to school, right? And I'm like, well, let's reimagine what we think parents are. Okay, so there are many, many young people who have supportive adults in their lives. You all are supportive adults in their lives. Would it be okay if this person's uncle or cousin or grandparent or adult ally comes to this family meeting or to this parent-teacher meeting, right? And so recognizing that what might feel like a resource in the community to a young person may not always feel that way to us, and that we should be sort of open and to understanding that there are multiple assets within the community that's already there. And so part of the asset mapping is to be able to ask, what am I gaining from my community? What resources are already present? And what am I giving? What can I give? What role do I play? Right? And so doing this exercise as an adult ally, and then also having your students do this, will really help them understand for you to hear what they consider to be supportive spaces within their communities. And then perhaps maybe they may also be missing things or may not think about something as being a resource when it might actually be one. Checking the unconscious. So as an educator, I firmly believe that we should always be in a constant state of reflection. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? What feedback or sources of support do we have, right? Do we check in with people after we are working with young people, do we check in with our peers or check in with the young people we're working with to make sure that it was okay, right? That we're on the right track. Are there blind spots that we have? And if we don't have the opportunity to reflect on that, we just sort of go through life and just continue doing what we're doing, and we never have an opportunity to really pause and check in with ourselves and check in with those that we work with. And so I'm gonna talk further in depth about the complexity of social identity in a second, but I wanna talk about journaling and seeking wise counsel. And so I think Katie mentioned this in her presentation, or maybe it was Reed, in terms of journaling, right? So being able to document and reflect on what you're doing. Keeping a journal is always very helpful. And then also for the young people you're working with, so that they can process their experiences and how they feel about certain situations, is being able to journal. And then seeking wise counsel. So we all have those moments when we might say something or do something, and something might be nagging us, like maybe I didn't say this correctly, right? So we all have a group of friends and peers or our own allies, right, who can check us, right, when we need it. And so I call that wise counsel, right? The people who have your back, right, and who are going to tell you the truth, right? We need those people in our lives. And so seeking wise counsel on, I have this situation, a young person is going through something really difficult. I want to approach it this way, but I'm not sure if this is the best way. What do you think, right? We have support around us, right? Young people have us and they have each other, and then we also have them and we have each other as well. And so utilizing the resources in our own lives can help us remind us to continue to reflect on our practice. So the complexity of social identity, I want to take a second to talk about that. Social identity is complicated. It can be kind of messy, can be very complex, right? And one of the things that I do with every student who walks through my door, through my classroom door, to want to work in community-based programs. Some of the high school students that I've worked with on the East Coast, I also engage them in this kind of process. Social identity, right? How we understand who we are, right? Our race, our ethnicity, our gender, our sexuality, spirituality, ability, social class, like all these kinds of things makes up, who we are. And with young people, I always enjoyed getting them to talk about and process through, what their various social identities mean. Because what happens is, while they might think or feel a certain way about their identities, the world is going to perceive them as something different. And how do they negotiate that, right? And I feel that my role, right, as an adult ally, is to prepare them, right, for how the world might view them, and to really have them understand and be sort of strengthened by and embrace their various social identities, but recognize that the world might see them differently. And so Pieces of the Pie is an activity that I encourage everyone working with youth, all youth, everybody should do, right? And it's pieces of the pie, but it could happen in a lot of different ways. And so I'm going to have you all take a minute to kind of go through this go through this exercise. So if you can grab a piece of paper, and if you could jot down, right, race, ethnicity, social class, sexuality, gender, all these kinds of things, ability, right? You don't have to list all of these, right? But some of your social identities, if you were to list them on a piece of paper, and then go through and ask yourself, right, what parts of these identities, right, grants me privilege, grants me a little bit of power? I almost wish that this was almost a different setting so that we could really hear how people responded to this kind of exercise. But I would like to hear from maybe one or two people about how this experience felt, right? What did it feel like to list a set of social identities that you have, and then to locate next to them whether or not you think it grants you any kind of privilege or power? Does anybody just want to say something about how it felt to do this exercise? Yes.
Uncomfortable.
Uncomfortable? Yep. Yep. It often feels uncomfortable. Yep. Yep.
Questioning.
Questioning.
Where do you fall in?
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks. Yes, questioning, uncertainty. Yep. Yep. I'll say that this exercise. Oh, okay. Thank you.
I was saying questioning yourself, uncertainty about where you would fall in personally into those different areas.
Did you want to repeat? Jamie?
being uncomfortable. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to look at this as what society would think as a power or what I believed to be.
Yeah.
So it was, what I believed and what I think society would believe were two different things, and it was very a big uncomfortable feeling.
Okay. Thanks for sharing. Anybody else? Maybe one more person? Okay, maybe two.
What I found difficult was for you to think about one of the things that makes you feel powerful or whatever. It's hard to think about that without thinking how it also makes others feel weak. When we start thinking about what kind of lifts us up above, we can't have that discussion without the people we're leaving down below.
Okay. Thank you. And then right here in the yellow sweater.
I think we kind of realize how complex this issue is and how many pieces of the pie there really are because, beyond the 6 that you listed, you also mentioned ability. And in our group, we started talking about age and especially working with young people or thinking about senior citizens and then also education level and, how there's just so much that goes into it that you're not always conscious of.
Yep. Perfect. Yep. So a couple of things that I want to mention that kind of echo some of your comments is that this is complex, and I purposely, when I lead this activity with young people and with adults, right, I purposely choose a binary for them, right, knowing full well, right, that as a society, things don't always exist on a binary, right? It's not just male, female, or person of color. Like people have intersections, right? And I want them to think about those intersections, right? So in terms of race and gender, right? In terms of class, right? What happens when you attain more educational level, right? Is there a certain privilege that's granted to you in that kind of in that way, or perhaps it changes from context to context, right? So. When I'm walking through the halls of the University of Wisconsin, like I feel like I have all this kind of academic privilege, but then when maybe a white colleague that I sat in a meeting with for 2 hours passes me and talks to me like they don't know me, right? I feel maybe that I have a little bit less sort of power in that kind of way, right? Or that, so there are lots of intersections and it's complex and it's not always easy, right? When I work with young people around this exercise, they struggle all the time with like race and ethnicity, right? Particularly being in New York City. Anybody live in New York City ever or visit New York, right? So New York is a really great place, right? And there are lots and lots of ethnic backgrounds. And so people sometimes conflate race and ethnicity. And so it's sort of explaining to young people, yeah, you can be Black and Latino, right? Or you can be Black and Jamaican, or you can be Asian and Jamaican, right? Like having them sort of understand those kinds of things can be really difficult. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that so pointing out that there are various kinds of identities that people have. You can do this with the rest of your staff, right, or with your students that lists so many others' identities, and that's okay, right? But the part of the exercise is one, getting them to wrestle with the complexity of identity, and then also recognizing these points of privilege, right? In the ways in which our privilege and can vary from context to context. And getting them to be able to question and to be able to kind of critically analyze how people are affirming or not affirming their identities, right? How does identity or various identities show up in the kind of work and the kind of projects they're able to create, right? These things don't go away, right? And at the beginning of my talk, I talked about framing and about how we imagine and how we think about youth. All of this is very much related to how we think about ourselves. And all too often, educators, adult allies, anybody, right, who is engaging with youth, if you fail to sort of reflect on who you are, right, all parts of you, right, and not to be afraid of doing that, right, if you fail to do that, what is the outcome of that, right? What are we missing? If we can't acknowledge our own identities, how can we be inclusive of the identities that young people bring to the spaces that we create, or the places that we support that they create for themselves, right? So. Social identity, extremely important. Okay. Let's see, so a few more that I'll point out. So being an adult ally, we've heard a lot already about the importance of relationship and how that is really at the basis for everything that we do. I will highlight the process results in relationships. So In my experiences with youth-led projects, sometimes things can be really tense, and I find that sometimes there is a dismissal of how we think about process, results, and relationships as a whole in the completion of a project, right? So process, how we actually carried out organizing a project. What happened? What are the mechanisms in place? How do we go about doing this? The results, right? The actual outcome of the project that we're doing, and then the relationships along the way. How do people work together, right? What's the climate like between the young people who are involved in this project? And so I'm sure many of you have experiences where youth might have put on a great event that had major results, but they all hate each other at the end of the project. And a lot of times that's because the managing the relationships, right, and understanding that the relationships of what happens, right, to the people who are working on this project is just as important as the results. Right, or just as important of how you get to your results or the process. So it's really important to be mindful, and I think the other presenters talked about sometimes it's hard to know when you can sort of jump in, right? We all believe in the power and the agency of youth that they can create and do their own thing, and so sometimes it feels weird when we want to jump in because we really want to honor their agency and honor what they're able to do. But there are times when we're able to see sometimes what they can't see, right? And so when we start seeing breakdowns in relationships, that should be just as important to us, right? To preserving those relationships and having them and dealing with that, right? And working through those relationships so that you have, a great outcome, a great result, or that the process along the way isn't terrible, right? So being mindful of process, results, and relationships. The other part of it is conscious intervention. So again, recognizing that we can struggle with when to intercede and when not to. I also find that when young people get stuck in their planning, right, is to recognize as an adult ally, right, that there are multiple pathways to action, right, and you can do this, or you can go through this sort of model as an exercise, as a brainstorm, right, as a conversation with young people. But recognizing that, so I'm not real tech savvy, so if I was, there would be arrows going all the way around here, right? So from problem to action and then back again, right? So if you think about, how you design your project, right? The problem we're really tackling, well, what is the problem that we are working towards or working with, right? The vision, how do we want to see, how do we envision this project, like if ideally, what would it look like? And what are the solutions? There are times when people get stuck in the design phase, right? Our young people, some of us, right, have a problem with sort of seeing the forest through the trees, right? And we need to sort of take a step back, right? And maybe let's talk about the problem. What is the problem we're tackling? Or maybe we don't need to stay in the problem stage. Maybe we need to actually do some visioning about what we want to see. So I find that this is a really useful strategy or model to go through ourselves, and then also to have young people go through. And again, you can do this through brainstorms. You can do this through in many kind of activities, and recognizing and actually having this posted so that people know, right? So that young people know, like this is the action, this is where we want to be, but there are many different ways to sort of get there. Okay, so creating inclusive spaces. Right. Tone setting. So part of or connecting back to the idea of social identity and inviting ourselves, and it's really about inviting our full selves, right? And so as a person, I as a youth worker who works a lot around social identity and race and gender and sexuality and class and all of that, I'm comfortable with using my race words, right, and my gender words. I'm comfortable with that. And when you become more comfortable with that, then it makes other people feel comfortable as well, right? Or it makes people comfortable in the sense that they feel like their whole beings can be within that space. Okay? And so part of I think creating an inclusive environment is setting up a space where young people feel like they can be their full selves, right? And it's really powerful when people acknowledge all of who you are, right? And so making sure that is a part of your space by not only inviting them to share their full selves, but also we need to be able to share our full selves as well. Culturally relevant and sustaining practices, right? So a lot of times when people think about cultural relevancy, you kind of go on the whole food fairs and festivals thing, right? Show me this and I'll show you mine, right? And there's some benefit there's some benefit to that, but that's not all it is, right? So culturally relevant being culturally relevant is really acknowledging, right, the spaces that your young people come from, right, and honoring not just the spaces that they come from, but also the practices, the cultural practices that they engage with, right? And so, and also recognizing that their lived realities are very much important to their progress and development. And having them understand the world in which they live is also a part of being culturally relevant, right? I firmly believe in having young people sort of read the world, right, or to sort of understand and be critical about all the things that they consume on a daily basis, right? So we know that our young people are all into media, and they have critiques and they have an understanding about media. But do we have a space for them to actually process those things, right? Can we create a space where they can maybe develop projects around the things that they do all the time, but perhaps people may not be aware of some of the nuances in those kinds of things, right? So for media, I love being able to deconstruct commercials that target gender, right? Or music videos. That's always fun to sort of talk about the complexities or the intersections between race and gender and class and like product placement, right? There's all these kinds of things that young people are engaged with. And so being culturally relevant is really being interested in inviting what they like, what they do, who they are into the spaces that we create. Someone mentioned this already in terms of the personal check-ins. I believe it was Katie, right? And part of inviting full self is to act like to care about who our students are. And so relevant personal check-ins and group cultural practices and standards. So right now in Madison, I do a lot of work with different organizations, and there's some organizations that have a really strong culture, right? If you ever walk into programs and you feel an energy, right? You recognize that there are certain practices or certain things that young people are saying, or that adult allies say, or that the space, right, looks a certain way, that they're a really strong sort of, the organizational culture is really strong in some spaces. And it's not so strong in others, and you can feel the difference. And so I encourage, all adult allies, along with their youth, to set the kinds of standards they want for their program and to create the kind of culture they want. And so when in doing that, if you set up a culture where inviting your full self or social identities, whether it's race or class or sexuality, those things are sort of out in the open. If that happens, if that occurs, then that culture is already set. And so people know when you walk into this organization, we are going to have a critical lens about race or gender or sexuality, or about politics, or about the immediate area or community that we're in. And part of doing that is really to make sure that we are doing it as well, right? That we can't shy away from it. Part of getting young people to do what we ask of them is also to do it ourselves, and I think that's really a part of trust. And trust has come up a lot. And as I just mentioned, we can ask a lot of young people, and if we aren't willing to do it ourselves, right, why should they ever trust us, right? And I don't know about you all, but I don't like one-sided relationships, and so having reciprocal relationships is important, right? And that sort of puts adults and youth on the same page, right, and recognizing that there's no elevation, right, but that we all play different roles. So I'll highlight affirmation and validation. I know that Katie mentioned this as well, but I do want to just point out the importance of a continual affirmation and validation. The story that Katie shared about being ignored by an adult, that really resonated with me because I've been there, like I've had that experience. And so it's really great it was really great when I was a young person and I looked to adults, and when they saw me, their eyes, got wide and they were so excited to see me, right? And so really validating, not only what I brought to that space, but who I am. And so that's visible in how we carry ourselves, right? And also to continually celebrate success throughout projects, and then also to process disappointments, right? That's really important to engage young people in conversations about, what happened and what can be changed and how are you feeling, right? Again, going back to process results and relationships, I can't tell you how many projects I was a part of as a young person, and it might have turned out fine, but I was mad for a while about something that happened, right? Something that, some sort of communication breakdown that I never got to process, right? And so ignoring those things allows it to kind of fester. So these are just other activities. Most of them I've mentioned already, and I guess the last one that I'll mention is this idea of shared agreements and expectations, and kind of creating the culture of the program, or the youth-led initiative is, how do we balance and how do we work with the complexity of our roles as adult allies, right? And part of that is really being comfortable with the fact that it is complicated, right? We wear many different hats, right? As that list on Katie's presentation showed, we are mentoring, we're guiding, we're teaching, we are sweeping floors, we are buying snacks, we are doing all kinds of things. And also recognizing that young people should also be having those same roles, right? So that at the same time, we are both teachers and learners, right? We are both mentors and those who are guiding, right? And that at certain times, young people sort of take on that role of as educator, as mentor, as guider, because there are things that we just don't know, right? If they're the experts of their own lives, then we need to be able to learn, and vice versa, right? When there are lived realities that we have as an adult ally, then they become listeners, right? And that's not a hierarchical thing, right? It's something that it's the roles that we play, right? If we don't elevate any of those roles, then it becomes an equal relationship. Okay. So just in conclusion, because I think I have 3 minutes left, right? As I already mentioned about being okay with complexity, our role as ally, teacher, listener, is also just to reiterate the importance of checking ourselves, right? Checking the unconscious. Checking our unconscious biases, right? And how that impacts how we frame, how we talk about youth, how we discuss about youth, and how we discuss youth in relationship to other youth, right? So that was something that was done to me a lot, right? Is you're different, right? You made it, right? You're different. You're articulate, right? Again, more of those sort of, racial slights, those microaggressions that make you really uncomfortable, but it's really hard to kind of pinpoint, because you're like, well, what you said, like articulate, yeah, that could be, a compliment, but it's not in this case, right? It's important for us to really become mindful, right, of how we really need to kind of rethink, right, how we understand youth in communities. And also just to say that this is not about sort of chastising anyone, right? We're all sort of complicit in many of this, right? In a lot of this. If we think about media, right? If we think about the messages that we get about youth and the messages that we get about certain youth, it all sort of seeps in, right? It all seeps in for all of us, right? So, but to be aware of that and to be able to disrupt it when it happens is really important. So I'll actually just go ahead and end there. I'm really looking forward to having a conversation with all of you and really learning more about some of the experiences that you have within your own program. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for listening.